Wow, everyone went very quiet there, and at the same time. The first job, isn't it, is to call the meeting to order. First of all, can I say a very, very warm welcome to this, which I think is a key event in our diary, isn't it? Get great speakers in, a great topic to talk about, something that's very current. And more than that, I think it's a super opportunity to meet colleagues and friends who perhaps we haven't seen for quite a while. My name is Sterling Crew, and I have the great pleasure to be the president of the IFST. And my job today is just to do a very quick welcome to you all, both those that are here in London, but fantastically across all our centres as well. So it's so great to have you all here. I should remember to talk into the mic and look up to the camera, because that's saying a very warm welcome to you as well. Can I start just by saying thank you to our sponsors, which is really important. The people actually pay for these events and manage to keep our costs down. So thank you very much to our sponsors. For your comfort and your safety, certainly in London, for your comfort, you know that the toilets are just round here on the right-hand side. And for your safety, there's no planned fire drill tonight. So if you hear the fire alarm go off, it's real. So please exit the building. Don't forget me. I'll need about 10 people to get me out of here, so please don't forget me. And also for your health and safety, I tend to fall on people. There's some good news and bad news. Tim is sitting there because he knows, because I have fallen on Tim in the past. I always fall to the right. So I'm really sorry, Wayne. When I come down the stairs, it's 50-50 chance I'm going to land on you. If I do fall, the doctor says to people, don't try to break my fall, just let me go. And every time I fall them, people have just let me fall. Not one person's gone under me and said, no, I'll stop you, I'll break your fall. So again, with the regional events, very welcome. It's live for them as well, and we're recording this so people can see it later on. Next slide, please, Tim. So it's important to know how you can ask questions. Tim will be running the Q&A afterwards. Please ask lots of questions. And if you're in the regions, you know that you use the www.slido.com. So if you use that, questions appears here, and you'll have just the same opportunity to ask questions as everybody else. Next slide, please, Tim. And so we've got a great subject to talk about and a great group of speakers. One of Tim's objectives is to add value to membership. So this year, instead of having just one speaker, we got two. The first time in our history, so it's as the retailers here amongst us will say, it's a buy one, get one free. So we got a bog off tonight. And we're just talking with Wayne and Jeremy about which one is the get one free, but we can't distinguish between them. They're talking about a really serious subject, about the challenges ahead of us. And those of you that are at the Great Spring Conference have already heard Wayne kind of give her a flavour of this. It was one of the best presentations I've ever seen, Wayne, and really exciting. So you don't have to do much tonight, do you? You just got that to beat, that's all. And what a time to be in the food industry. I've been in it for 40 years, and I don't think I can remember any time when we've had so many challenges. And not just the type of challenges. Normally they come, don't they, in series. You might have massive challenge, wait 5 years and another one comes out, wait 5 years and another. But now we seem to have like a perfect storm of challenges, all coming at the same time. And our industry is under a lot of pressure. Whether that is climate change, as we'll hear from today, probably the biggest challenge, whether it's sustainability, whether it's war. And we've seen how war in a distant land has impacted upon our food security. And who would have thought 5 years ago that we in the UK and Europe would be talking about food security? It always seemed to be something that happened elsewhere in the world. So real challenges. Challenges of new science and innovation, which are providing both solutions, opportunities, but also threats in the eyes of our consumers. We've had challenges, as we know, with COVID, which even though it wasn't carried by food, had a massive impact upon our supply chain. We've had challenges when it comes to animal diseases. The list goes on and on and on, and I think I could probably list 20 of them, and we could all in this room discuss each one. Just a hint from me, I think the biggest challenge, I was at a meeting of the great and the good the other day, and of all the challenges, the 20-odd challenges that we could have talked about, the one thing that everyone had in common was people. And we all thought that it is the retention and recruitment of talent into the food sector is the biggest challenge of all. Because if we don't have the right people, if we can't keep them, then the industry has no chance whatsoever of overcoming these challenges. So that, I think, is a role that the IFST can play, is help encourage food science and technologists to do our courses, but also anyone, as Tim always says, who does any science degree. How do you encourage them to join our industry, which employs more people than anyone else in the country, over 400,000? So that would be a big challenge for everybody in this room, is we're looking for any ideas you have of how do we recruit more people. So many of you will already know Dr. Wayne Martindale. He's a trustee on our board, looks after the secretariat, he does all our minutes, and we have great insight from Wayne. He comes from not the University of Lincoln. Is that right, Wayne? Because I get it wrong. It's the Lincoln...
Not Lincoln University.
Not Lincoln University, which is based in the Maldives and in New Zealand. You're based actually in Lincoln.
At the University of Lincoln.
Yeah. I keep getting it wrong and thinking, if I sidle up to Wayne, maybe I'll get out to the Maldives one day. But no, he says that doesn't happen.
I have heard that Lincoln University has a campus in the Maldives, so don't get them mixed up.
Right, I won't. But I always do. And as I said before, we've had Wayne do a fantastic, I thought, presentation at the IFST seminar that we had. And that's why you're here today, Wayne, I think, is to develop that further. And we're very lucky to have Professor Jeremy Hill here. Thank you for attending, Jeremy, who's from University of Masai, which is Masai, not Masai, that would be in Kenya, wouldn't it? Which is one of the preeminent, I think, universities when it comes to food safety, and he'll be introducing himself and some of the work he's done. So what country is that in? New Zealand, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you're over here now, and the World Cup's on. Is that a coincidence? That's what we were trying to work out, and New Zealand are playing Ireland.
It's a hardship trip.
Yeah, so there might be many reasons why Jeremy's here. So without further ado, can I introduce our two speakers who have got some fascinating things to update us on. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for the kind words, Sterling. That day in May when I spoke in Cardiff, I must say everything clicked together really well. You know when something's gone well, so I hope I don't disappoint. Okay. A little bit of background here. I met Jeremy about 4 years ago in Rotterdam at the European Federation for Food Science and Technology, IFST, meeting. And I don't rove around the world going to conferences, I'm not that kind of academic because I know the work piles up at home and I'd rather keep on top of that stuff. But it was really important to get out sometimes. They let me out sometimes, and it was a really fortuitous meeting because I can remember Jeremy presenting a poster on some of the things he's going to present tonight, and it was just such a kind of hitting a brick wall moment for me because I realized someone else is working on what I'm really interested in and applying what I'm trying to apply here. And it was all about understanding the food system and how we could project the chaotic nature of the food system. And when we had the opportunity to present to you tonight, we were thinking about a photo that kind of summed up what the food system was about, and it's this photo. Very famous photo called Earthrise. It was taken by Bill Anders, an astronaut on Apollo 8. It was probably the first full picture of the planet Earth rising above the moon. And there's a narrative out there on the internet if you want to look, and it's quite funny because they're all scrambling for cameras and so on. But the key thing about this blue planet is we don't want it going brown or red, okay? And it's, to all intents and purposes, a closed system. We can't break the laws of physics here. We can't break the second law of thermodynamics. And what we've done over the last 250 years is essentially utilize the resources available to us, and we're recognizing that there's some payback for that. And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about tonight, because we don't want to live in a hostile world. Anyone that saw me talk in May knows, despite what my daughters tell me, I am an optimist. And I believe that humankind will overcome the challenges put before us so long as we utilize innovation and food science and science generally. The other thing that I myself and Jeremy did before speaking tonight was I asked Jeremy, well, if there was one thing that's really influenced our study of trying to project what's happening in the food system, what is it? And perhaps we could choose one each. And this is my one. And it's called, well, the actual relationship that you see there moving about is an outcome of something called the logistic equation. And it's an incredible thing. I learned about the logistic equation probably in the mid-80s. It was put into biological systems by a theoretical physicist called Professor Sir Bob May, who became the UK chief scientist. But what the logistic equation is essentially a function that's an exponential growth rate and a carrying capacity that keeps on bashing down that growth rate. And if you reiterate this equation several times, you end up with quite chaotic outcomes that you can see here. And that's the basis behind a lot of what I now write, a lot of what I now research is how do we project what's going on in that chaotic system? And I hope that you can see some kind of alignment there with what happens with regards to food security and food supply, because it's absolute. We're often dealing with chaos. Chaos isn't bad if you know when it's coming and you know how to project it. And that's what really understanding systems is about, to be more resilient in this chaotic situation. This is Jeremy's slide, and I presented this in May, and it's a famous schematic of the global food system. And I think it's more of a metabolic map in many ways, but it's the same as the previous slide. There are individual functions, but when all these individual functions come together, we can get chaotic outcomes. I'm a little bit biased. In the center of that diagram, it's how we put all that stuff together in manufacturing. Okay? So that's the introduction. 5 minutes of me. You now have, Jeremy, a seamless presentation.
So, firstly, it's a real privilege to be invited to speak this evening. It's an honor. And I'm only going to be able to, excuse the pun, give you a flavour of what we've been doing in modelling. And I think my key role tonight is quite simply to make Wayne look good from my presentation. But what I'm going to do now is just show you a short video of what the modelling work is all about that we do at Massey University in the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative.
Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, or SNI, provides clear evidence for the sustainable food system debate. We're hosted by the Riddett Institute, a New Zealand Centre of Research Excellence at Massey University. The SNI team has expertise in human nutrition, food technology, agriculture, data science, and mathematical modelling. This expertise is used to design tools to help understand food systems, from global production and trade down to sustainable diets for individuals. For example, the Delta model is our online tool for understanding the sustainability of the global food system. It calculates what changes to things like food production, population, and food waste will do for the nutrition of the global population. The model is used in academic and industry research, policy advice, and by students at our partner universities. The SNI team can help academics, the food industry, policymakers, and government departments to better understand food systems and human nutrition. On our website, you'll find examples of our outreach and collaborations. If you're interested in being involved, please get in touch.
And why this is so important, I think Sterling summed it up really well. We used to have periodic challenges. We now have just one strain after another of the food system. And with that is the danger of making knee-jerk reactions to try and fix it that are based on partial information and an incomplete picture of what needs to change in order to produce the nutrition we need in the future sustainably. And that's simply what the SNI is about, starting with the principle that no food system is sustainable unless it provides the minimum amount of nutrition required by the population. Right? So pretty basic. It's actually the first point made by the UN in terms of what sustainable food systems are all about. And another point, and Sterling was talking about this, it's very, very important that we nurture the future talent that will hopefully take this work forwards and if having an impact through staying with the SNI or moving to other research institutes around the world, can build on the insights and the modelling that we are creating in the SNI. And we do have quite a diverse team. We've got people from Yorkshire, where I'm from, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Ghana, and Singapore, as well as a cohort of New Zealanders. And they're a pretty talented team. So when we hire people in to the SNI, we look for two things. Can they do the work? Right? Have they got the wherewithal to get through the PhD work or the postdoctoral work in order to help with the development of aspects of our modelling? And the other thing we look for is outstanding communicators, because that's so important. This is that shift diagram earlier just shows how complex the system is that we're trying to deal with. So we need outstanding communication in that respect. And we've got a number of outstanding communicators, not least of which is Nick Smith, who's the voiceover you heard on that previous video. We also have a number of partners. I'm going to be talking briefly about some of the work we do with these partners. So in the University of Sao Paulo, we've done some global trade modelling. So this looks at all the food that moves around the world and how that impacts the nutritional status of the population in all the countries of the world on a 29 nutrient basis. So not just food biomass, but turning that food biomass into 29 nutrients. So that's pretty important. We do some work with San Diego on bioavailability, and particularly calcium bioavailability, and you'll see the importance of that in a second as well. And a range of other organisations, particularly bargaining on closed-loop systems, and then a number of other New Zealand and Australian academic institutions. And essentially what we're doing is modelling at three scales. So if you're making choices as an individual, what will those choices mean? And the way we do this is we develop algorithms that can then be adapted to particular situations within a country. So what's available in terms of the food within that country? If I make dietary choices, what does that do for my nutrition? What does that do for the cost of my diet? What does that do for the sustainability characteristics of those choices I make? There's then the regional or national modelling, and this is really important because it's at this scale and moving down into real chains, which I'll finish with in a second, that actually brings about the changes that you need to improve the system. But critically, and what I'll talk about in more detail today, is the Delta model, which sets the global context for what is possible and practical at that global level. We've got a number of models within here. We just received $10 to $11 million from the New Zealand Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment to develop a model for the New Zealand food system. It's a national model, but really it's a multi-regional model that we're developing. That's a 5-year program. We've recently completed some work on Norway. Norway's an interesting country. It's one of the most affluent in the world. They've got lots of choices in terms of personal wealth, what they can eat, but did some modelling on what those choices might mean, and we'll be publishing a paper on that soon. And Kenya, and you'll see why Kenya is particularly important in a second, and we're collaborating with the Gates Foundation on trying to model the Kenyan system. And that's critical. There's 50 million people in Kenya. And as you'll see, they're very short of nutrition. Our global models, we look at food productivity, so crop productivity, model 280 crops across the world, how their local production impacts the productivity characteristics of those crops. We've also started to include the alternatives, so precision fermentation. If you think of the food biomass, it can go into humans through various changes in the food system. It could be fed to animals, or it could be fed to these still fermenters. So we're looking at what that might mean for the future of the food system as well. We do publish our work and the insights that we have gained from that work. And although that's very important, and it's very important for the credibility of the work that we do, that it has been subject to peer review, even more important is that we make our models openly accessible on our website. So you can get a login code, you can go to the website, and you can use these models to interrogate the food system yourself. And we think that's extremely important. We've got students around the world using these models and a number of academic research organisations. So to the Delta model. This was the first model we developed. We started developing this model in 2018. It's like painting the Forth Bridge. You get to one end and you start again. There's no end to the enhancements we can make to this particular model. Is it perfect? No. But it's pretty good at giving you a broad context of what's possible and practical in the changes you can make in the global food system. And critically, and I think this was the clever thing that we did, was we made it visual. It's very, very complex to look at data on this global food system if you can't do it from a visual perspective. So, what does the Delta model do?
A challenge we face is our ability to sustainably nourish an increasing global population without exceeding the capacity of the planet. There are many different ways of approaching this challenge and many suggestions for what the answer may be. The Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, or SNI, developed the Delta model to generate informed discussion about food system sustainability. The model helps people explore changes to the food system themselves by changing components of the system and viewing the impact on the supply of nutrients. The model uses global food system data from international agencies and research to predict the nutrition available to the global citizen, both now and in future scenarios. The user can adjust the production of different food groups, the degree of food waste, and the global population to see the impact of these changes on human nutrition. The model also calculates some of the other non-nutritional impacts of these changes, such as the amount of cropland required. The model has featured in multiple publications in scientific journals and has hundreds of users around the world. The SNI team has made the model openly accessible on our website so that anyone can have the chance to explore the global food system. This allows everyone to see the importance of considering nutrition when thinking about food system sustainability.
Now, it's called plant-based and animal optimized because our investigations show that 75% of all the food consumed is plant-based, and 87% of all the food produced globally is plant-based. About 15% of that food is fed to animals. But the efficiency of the two chains are quite different. There's a lot of plant-based food waste, which is often missed in some of the rhetoric about the food system. Now, essentially, what this does is it lets you look at side-by-side scenarios by changing some of the characteristics of the food system. So our base year is now 2020. It was originally 2018. We've just updated it. So you've got all of the food produced in the world in 2020 converted to the 29 nutrients in the model. You can then change that. And you can change it by changing the amount of the food produced from different commodity crops. Or in our recent version 2.1, you can expand that to change the particular crop. So, for example, now you can change the different cereals and so on and so forth. And what that does, this is a very simple scenario. So this is the food produced in 2020, where we've got a population of 7.6, 7.7 billion people, compared to the needs of the population in 2050, when we've got 9.7 billion people, if we did not increase the amount of food. And what you see is we actually have more or less enough macronutrition. So we shouldn't get supply and demand confused, right? So from a macronutrient perspective, including the most limiting amino acid, which is lysine in the system. So if you think of protein as a nutrient delivery system, and the actual nutrients are the amino acids, and particularly the indispensable amino acids which we can't synthesize as individuals. And what you see here is the recommended daily intake adjusted demographically for per capita consumption on a global basis. So behind this, we use the UN data on what the population actually is. So the nutritional needs of different segments of the population are actually different. Now, the bit that we don't have, that we need to improve on, is we don't have the over 60s. And I'm particularly keen on getting that in the model. Because we don't really have any defined nutrient intakes for the older age group. But we better get cracking on that, because as we all know, that older age group is increasing. And so what you see is in this scenario, just the upper and lower bars are the safe lower and upper limits. And what you see in this scenario is that actually, from a macronutrient point of view, perhaps apart from fiber, we're in pretty good shape. But that's not the case with micronutrients. So there's been a lot of work on this. So we know that globally micronutrient deficiency affects about 30% plus of the global population now. And that's through a lack of choice or poor choices where people can afford to buy those nutrients. And so what you see here is even in 2020, we haven't got enough vitamin E or calcium. And by 2030, a number of other micronutrients start to appear in deficit, and that situation just gets worse as we go out years, unless we produce more food, but more of the right foods. So when it comes to protein, we often hear producing more protein. What we actually should be looking for is proteins that come in nutrient-dense foods that provide the micronutrients as well, rather than just the proteins. The model also lets you look at waste. So in this case, I've taken the calcium, which we know is in deficit, and what you've got here is what happens if we remove food waste. And what you see here is that actually it doesn't change much. There's a bit of a kick up from the provision of plant-based calcium, but there's not much of a change in the major source, which is milk. And that's because milk isn't wasted significantly on a global basis. The other feature that I'd share with you tonight, there's lots of different features in this model, is bioavailability. and the impact of bioavailability. And what you see here is the bioavailability of the amino acids when you include bioavailability, so that's the digestibility absorption of the amino acids, when that's on, which is the first scenario, and when it's off. And that's so important because you get a false impression, of how much nutrition you actually have. So bioavailability is a key feature, and hence that comment about working with San Diego on calcium bioavailability, which obviously is a critical thing to do, as we see here. Now, I mentioned before that we can look at all the countries around the world and look at what's imported and what's exported, and I've picked the UK, of course. And in the UK, what you see here is that range again, how much the requirements are, the upper and lower ranges. You see the UK has actually got ample calories, but that's a result mainly of imports. I was quite surprised at this. So if you look at the net situation in the UK, you've got a slight calorie deficit against the population needs of the UK. US is quite different. It produces a lot of calories and consumes a lot of calories. The dotted line, by the way, is the global average. Now, what might surprise you is that big populations actually have enough if it was equally distributed, right? Now, clearly that's not the case. There are issues in China, there are terrible issues in India with the distribution of this nutrition within country. And we've done some work on that. I haven't got time to go into that tonight. But what you see is a picture of the energy haves. And coming to that point I raised about Kenya and some of these other countries, you've got the energy have-nots. They don't even have enough calories to feed the population. And what you see here is they've nowhere near enough calories before, for example, in Kenya, they export a lot, which is important in terms of revenue for the country. There's an economic component to this, not to be forgotten in this modelling. They import a little, but they're still left with this relatively large deficit. If we look at protein, a similar situation. In this case, the UK does produce enough protein, but then exports quite a bit, imports quite a bit, and has quite a significant surplus. And similarly, in the US, and the same applies to China and India again. Bearing in mind that point that this is not ubiquitously distributed, so there are access issues within country. And that's the same in New Zealand, where I'm from, and I'm sure it's the case in the UK, where there are segments of the UK population that are struggling to afford food. But it's not necessarily a production issue, it is an affordability issue. And again, Kenya and some other countries, major deficit on protein. So protein and calorie malnutrition. And just to hand over to Wayne, one of the important things that we do is we provide what I would describe as a really important context for the changes that need to be made in the global food system or national food system or the sorts of changes individuals might make. But all change is local. It's what you might choose to buy at a supermarket, but critically, it's the data that we provide in chain to our farmers, to our factories, to our supply chains, right the way through to retail that allows us to make the appropriate changes within that context. Wayne, now I'm sure I'm going to make you look good.
Excuse me. So hopefully you can see why I got so excited when I saw the Delta poster in Rotterdam in 2019. I was struggling with ideas about how you fit functions together to project what's going to happen in the food system. And these guys in New Zealand, they were working on these 29 nutrients and trying to fit them together. And it's almost like a Rubik's Cube. And they'd found a vehicle that could give solutions. And that's truly exciting. Not just as an academic exercise, but as a human exercise, as an industry goal. You know, we want to do good. We want to do good things in our food science community. And of course, we want to survive, which is the theme of the talk tonight. Incidentally, Jeremy mentioned, you know, the over 60s. The 60s are in sight for me, probably, in a fair while. That Earthrise photo was taken in 1968, on Christmas Eve in 1968. I was 3 years old. Jeremy was 5. We're baby boomers, yeah? We're the first generation to see this stuff coming close to home. We're the first generation to learn about environmental change, climate change in our undergraduate degrees. It was new in the mid-80s, yeah? So all that stuff has happened in our generation, and essentially, I guess, we really can't screw it up for our children and grandchildren. So this slide introduces me. I would usually put it at the front end of a talk. I work at the University of Lincoln at the National Centre for Food Manufacturing. One of the key things that I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so is bring the Delta model to a local level, because what we do at the National Centre for Food Manufacturing is demonstrate things. So you can see a robotics demonstrator there, an automation demonstrator. One of the key things you have to do when you're putting things together and making consumer goods is you have to show how it's done. And I think that interface between academic and practical demonstration is really, really important here. But if you don't have the models to project where you're going, you're not going to succeed. It doesn't work, okay? The other thing that I'll point out there is I've published over the last 7 years with a number of colleagues, in particular Tom Hollands, who I've worked very closely with, and we've published in the Institute's Food Science and Technology Journal. A key theme in Jeremy's talk, certainly latent and possibly in the background, is that we have to communicate really complex stuff. If we don't do that effectively, then again, it's not going to work. And one of the things that the Institute does, and in particular the Food Science and Technology Journal, is it communicates to our food science community. And we've written around all sorts of wonderful things: blockchains, digital twins, carbon footprints of sandwiches. Our most popular article is growing food on Mars. I mean, who would have thought, you know? Absolutely fabulous. And it's an honor to write for that journal. So, before I bring you back down to earth, I'm going to sort of take you a bit further and think about remote sensing and space. But on this theme of hostile environments and showing you that it's closer to home than we think, in the past couple of years we've had courgette crisis, cauliflower crisis, tomato crisis. These, I believe, are the first signs, the first saber rattles of things that might not be working as well as they could be. And what you see here in the bottom part of this slide is where we source subtropical produce from, or a large proportion of subtropical produce: Morocco, South Africa, and Spain. And I just want to say that the red colour is not good, okay? The red colour is in the month of December, halfway through the growing season for these subtropical fruits, and agricultural stress is the highest it can be, and that's last December. So again, this data is available. It's open source, a bit like the Delta model. It's open source. We can utilize it. I have a team of researchers mining this type of data to understand how this data moves dynamically through the year, so that we can mine it and project what's going to happen with regards to drought, flood, weather events, and so on. And that's exceptionally useful in the fresh produce market. It allows us to be more survivable, more resilient. What you see in the top tiles are dynamic photos of photosynthetic activity in those regions of the world from remote sense satellites, the Sentinel satellites. Now, I can get remote sense data anywhere in the world, more or less, apart from the most sensitive regions in the world, from 3 to 10 days ago. And I've got a team of people that are doing much brighter things than I can do with AI and sorting data, but they're mining that data to help project models put them into models such as the Delta model and others so that we can project outcomes. And if we can do that, it's not just an intellectual effort, it's a real applied survivability outcome that's really important. On the theme of surviving, of course, food security isn't just about understanding the weather, understanding the impact of climate change. Since the early 70s, I've been aware of global conflict in East Africa. In the early 1970s, I remember the pictures. Maybe one of the reasons that I'm into food. I couldn't believe that those insecurity situations existed for a guy growing up in this corner of northwestern Europe. And what I want you to do is look at the tile image of the Ukraine region on the left of this slide and concentrate on that. I'm not going to hypnotize you, okay? But if you look at that, the white color is not snow, okay? It's a time-lapse, remote-sensed image of photosynthetic activity in the region of that region of the world between January and July. When it goes white, there is no photosynthetic activity, or photosynthetic activity is reduced to close to zero. So keep looking at the left. When it goes white, that's January. That's very cold. No photosynthetic activity. As we go into March, April, May, June, July, the longest day of the year, photosynthesis is going gangbusters. So it goes dark green, white, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. Now look to the right. It's still white. That was what was happening this year. On the left is a normal year. Yeah? So as we get dark green in a normal year, this year there was no photosynthetic activity. Now mining these data sets, we're talking about petabytes of data, huge data sets. But using that data, we can project things like, well, what impact is that going to have on oilseed production, cereal production in that part of the world? And clearly, there's huge reductions in photosynthetic yield, crop yields in that part of the world this year. And it's taken 2 years to do that because in 2021 and 2022, it was pretty much a normal picture. But the impact of that is going to ripple. And that is famine, that is insecurity, because the oilseeds and cereals that come from this part of the world go to the most vulnerable parts of the world. And we're seeing the outcomes of that now. And to be fair, I've sat in front of MPs recently and spoken about security. And the focus has been on cyber security, defense security, and we have to think about food security because it's close to home now. It isn't just pictures of famine in East Africa in the early 70s anymore. It's very close to home. Survivability is important, and we're important in driving that debate forward and making sure people think about food security, the new food security. I'm going to bring you back down to earth now. No more remote sensing. I want to introduce you to how we're putting this science into a factory situation in this part of the world. In a little corner of southeast Essex called Chelmsford, where we have a project called the S3 project, Smart People, Smart Process, Smart Factory. And I'm working with Tom Hollins, who's the Technical Director and Innovation Director of Rayner Foods Limited. We have been privileged enough to obtain a £3 million grant to fund a project. The funding's from Innovate UK. The partners across the project are the University of Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing, the University of Lincoln, me, of course, and a vertical farming company called Let Us Grow. And this is what we do. These are some photos of the project. One of the key things that's happening, and I want to demonstrate to you how we're integrating these complex models around security, solving the Rubik's Cube of how things are put together, is we're sensoring the Rainer Foods enterprise as a factory. So we're putting sensors that can map the movement of equipment, such as cleaning machines that you see here. The middle photo, top photo, is the project manager, who looks absolutely stunned to be standing next to a robotic bin that measures how much waste is coming off the lines, what quality of waste that is, and what quantity of waste that is in real time, and goes into a sensor that's measuring the amounts and quality in real time. You can see the sensors going into the factory. At the end of the day, the bottom left photo shows you what it's all about. It's about putting sliced tomatoes, sliced eggs, and things together to make good products that will fulfill customers and provide the nutrition that's required. The bottom photo shows our collaborator from Cambridge University, a guy called Ergen Guncore, Dr. Ergen Guncore, who works with Steve Evans, Professor Steve Evans at the Institute for Manufacturing. And the really innovative thing that I kind of overlook because I'm a sort of technical scientist more than a social scientist, but Ergen's bringing in this idea of gamifying practices so that they produce the best outcomes in terms of sustainability and productivity. And that's transforming how we're thinking about how resources move around this factory to create the optimal outcomes, both from a food safety point of view, a sustainability point of view, and so on. Now, this is a little bit of my research. I feel comfortable talking about this stuff. It's a carbon footprint, but it goes right to the heart of what Jeremy was talking about. The food system is incredibly complex, but we need to get that flow diagram on the right into a format that everyone understands. We can't have only 1% understanding what decarbonising or net zero is. We have to have vehicles like the Delta model that are, one, open access, accessible, or accessible rather than open access, and also understandable. And if we get that right, we become more resilient. We survive, okay? Now, producing a life cycle assessment or carbon footprint like the one you see on the right there is pretty easy to do nowadays. Huge amounts of data. It's just a case of having someone like me to put it together. But in many ways, it's just a press of a button on a computer now. That flow diagram is for a prawn mayo sandwich, okay? The materials in that prawn mayo sandwich account for something like 220 grams of greenhouse gas emission per product. So that's the carbon footprint, but it's a static piece of information. And a static piece of information in a consumer goods industry that is fast moving, it becomes almost meaningless in some ways. So you have to censor how that's moving around the enterprise to really get a good picture of what it means, not just to your customers or consumers, but also your workforce. Because if your workforce isn't engaged, you're not going to get anywhere. The other reason, I guess, why we do carbon footprints is to cut through the baloney here. Yeah? Anyone that's working in this area knows that greenwash, wild figures around our diet and nutrition exist. And certainly recently, that prawn mayo sandwich that was about 200 grams was reported to be more like 20 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions. 100-fold greater. We've got to use the evidence and the numbers, but in order to do that, we need to transfer it in a suitable form that people understand. We can't put that on a label, for example. And I remember something that someone told me who's in the audience at this point. I was working with Igloo Food Group and Birdseye, and Peter Hadjipiris, who's in the audience here. I was working with Peter. He was the CSO, CTO of Igloo Food Groups at the time, and it kind of transformed my thinking. Peter said at the time, you've got to build sustainability into the brand. And if you do that, and you get all that evidence into the brand, I mean, they were lucky they had Captain Birdseye as an iconic brand. Everyone recognized that. But if you build that into that image, and all that evidence is behind it, all the good stuff follows through. All the net zeros, all the great nutritional information, that's likely to follow through. And most importantly, consumer fulfillment. Because if we're not producing foods that people enjoy, then sustainability again gets further and further away. The other thing about carbon footprints, as I said, you know, that things move around. Fast-moving consumer goods. To take a Yorkshire term here, it says what it does on the can. They move around really fast, and carbon footprints don't tend to move around. The other thing that carbon footprints don't do is they don't relate to how much product is being produced. So thinking about that gamification process from Ergun again, when you've got a production series of a number of products that I show along here on the x-axis, different types of sandwiches, and you have the carbon footprint of those products, shown by the red line, that's the ratio of the carbon footprint to product weight, so when it's high, the carbon footprint is higher. And the black line, which is the amount of volume of product produced, if you've got a high carbon footprint, and low volume being produced, your risk in terms of sustainability is relatively low. On the other hand, when the volume starts to go up, your risks and flags, gamification flags that are saying, you know, be more careful, don't waste, etc., become active. If your volume being produced is greater than the carbon footprint, then that's the highest risk. And you follow this through. It's not really that difficult. Again, you know, I learned about calibration during that period when I was working with Peter. It's about calibration, and gamifying that calibration becomes really, really powerful because you engage people, you engage workforce, you engage customers. You can potentially, with things like the Delta model, engage society. So, the real world is fuzzy and nebulous, okay? And we don't account for that in these static footprints. And we have to be dynamic. We have to think more dynamically about consumer goods. One of the things that we're doing here, and this is our initial trial, way back in May, way back in May in Cardiff, I said in the Smart People, Smart Process, Smart Factory project, we will be ready to demonstrate by the end of this year. I still think we will be. This is some data from the initial trial of censoring the factory. What you see on the far right are the lines where the sandwiches are being made. There's 5 lines there. And all those pink or purple dots, slightly colorblind, but all those dots are data points from 4 sensors. 2 sensors on trolleys delivering ingredients to the line, and 2 sensors on people who are on the line, okay? We've now scaled up these sensors because we know they work, and there's about 300 sensors in the factory across equipment, workforce, and other assets. And what you see with these 70,000 dots is when you segment them into equipment and people, you begin to see clusters, okay? And these clusters become really, really important. And when you look at how people are moving around the lines, this person is quite diffuse. They're doing about 70 kilometers a week. This person is more direct. They're doing about 20, 25 kilometers a week, okay? And this is a cluster for a trolley delivering ingredients to the line, okay? And the next phase is another trolley. They're all part of those 70,000 dots. But when you're able to build up models like this, you're essentially building a digital twin of the factory in real time. Now, you've all heard of digital twins, perhaps. You know, this idea that you can develop a metaverse and walk around it and decide what you're going to make tomorrow, kind of thing. Well, this is the data version. I think it's a more practical, understandable version, and crazy prices are put on digital twins. Oh, that's going to cost you £30 million, etc., etc. Well, we've done this in S3, and it hasn't cost £30 million, okay? But what it's doing is it's reporting how resources are moving around that operation in real time. And if you have that data, you can be more resilient, you can be more survivable, you can report sustainability. Now, I've worked on carbon footprinting and life cycle assessments for 25 years. Started with ammonia plants, which were pretty simple compared to food factories. But one of the things that life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting don't do in the standards is they don't build in the human component of actually putting products together. And that's exactly what we're doing in this project, because we're actually assessing how things are made. And that's very much the world that I'm in. And if you understand that, you can be a lot more resilient. I'm going to take you back to space. If we want to survive, and we want to be resilient in what could be a more hostile world, and bear in mind I use those words cautiously, where do you go for blank slate development of the food system? And as I mentioned previously, myself, Tom Hollands, and my colleague at NCFM, Mark Swainson, we wrote an article about growing food on Mars in the Food Science and Technology Journal. You know, I'm going to plug it again because it's so wonderful. But this is the article. And if you really wanted to understand how to produce food in the most hostile environment, then that's where you go. When this idea came up, the idea didn't come from me. You know, we should understand how to grow food in space. It wasn't me. It was the industry that did it, because the industry was interested in controlled environment farming and so on. And it aligns. And a lot of things I hope you can see in both myself and Jeremy speaking tonight. There's a lot of alignment coming together here. The Rubik's Cube is being solved. So that article, like I said, is one of our most popular. Everyone's interested in space. Lastly, this is myself and Jeremy. This is how our kind of drop the mic spot. Yeah, we were thinking, how do we round off this joint talk, and we decided that we would mock up. Please bear with us. We would mock up the front page of a newspaper. Tuesday the 10th, it is a Tuesday, I looked it up before anyone says, yeah. 10th of October, 2045, and it's written by myself and Jeremy. We're really hopeful, yeah? We're optimists. However, this front page isn't very optimistic. It says, essentially, we haven't got there. We keep regurgitating, we keep revisiting this net zero position because no one's listening. No one's listening to the evidence. So we keep going back to 2030. Oh, we didn't meet it again. And we can't afford to do that. So, again, bear with us on this. An alternative is that we foil this situation. And we create a community where the science and evidence is listened to, and we act on that evidence. And we do get to these net zero positions. And I think innovation, human capital, has all the ability to do that. I guess the question that myself and Jeremy would put to you tonight is, which camp are you going to be in? The revisit or the foil again? And certainly from my own point of view, and I'll also speak for Jeremy here, we can't afford to keep revisiting. We've got to change. Thank you for listening. No, we're taking questions. Seamless. Excuse me.
I like the extreme example of growing food on Mars. It's a good way of pushing yourself to a big extreme and then you backing off that to sort of say, how could we make this work practically on Earth? And an example was active suspension. And to improve active suspension, somebody suggested, we'll make the wheels square. What would you have to do then to have a smooth ride? And that takes you to an extreme in terms of how you'd have to get active suspension to work. So it's classic Edward de Bono, if you're familiar with his concept of pushing boundaries.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Wayne. So we're going to come to some questions now. And if you'd like to ask a question here in the room, please raise your hand. And if you would like to ask a question from the branches, then please go to Slido, and they will come up seamlessly on the screen in front of me. So I'm going to ask one of the questions that's come up here first, and this is an interesting one, I think. There's a couple on this theme, and it is, given the global challenge with food loss and waste, the ironic problem of global food insecurity, how can we optimize to get an equilibrium between those two?
Well, I think the important point, and if you look at where we've got food insecurity, it's not in the countries or the individuals that are wasting the food. And so you've actually got a food affordability issue that goes along with the food waste. So just removing the food waste, if that food's still not affordable, won't solve the problem. So we've got to understand how we get nutrition produced in a more affordable way, and what foods we need to produce to supply that type of nutrition. So it's extremely challenging to do, given the way the industry is today. But if we don't do that, that sort of picture of micronutrient or protein and calorie, and there are terrible micronutrient issues in those countries as well, will just get worse and worse. And that's not a food security issue, that's a security issue. Those populations will move. They'll have no choice.
No, I think that was your answer, Jeremy. That's pretty much the Delta model. And I'll go back to the point that I probably learned early on in my career and still hold to, that if you can't sort out a problem intellectually before you go in and practically test it, then you're going to have a higher risk and less chance of getting to where you want to be. And you know, the Delta model, putting single functions like, well, I say single functions like nutrition, I know there's several things going on, and like waste together, and allowing you to project, puts you on a much more confident footing before you begin to test. And I don't want to say it, but you know, if you can't measure, you can't manage.
Indeed. And just on another key feature is our models currently don't account for production losses, so the losses that occur before the food leaves the farm or the oceans, or so the catch that's lost on the ships and so on. It's something that Ajovi, our Nigerian student, is working on, looking at those aspects. Very, very important, and particularly as we get into our national modelling.
And it depends on the quality of the data, of course. Yeah? Better data, garbage in, garbage out. We can't afford to do that. So understanding what 9 billion consumers are going to do is really the goal here.
Just to build on that, one of our students who's finished now basically did a complete sensitivity analysis on our models and said, do the conclusions these models generate change with a 20% change in accuracy of the data with a 50% change in accuracy? So we've done that as well. And overall, they don't. They tend to hold.
Just another quick question on the model. Does it take account of seasonality and also of any big climate changes, floods and droughts and things like that?
And national models will.
The national model as well?
The national models, because of the nature of the Delta model, it sort of does with the food trade component. All of the three models, the IOTA model, our national models, and the Delta model are essentially different aspects of that complex shift diagram. So they're all required to give us a full picture. But the national models will be particularly important in that respect.
And they're coming?
Well, we've done Norway, which is a very affluent 5 million people. They can basically import all the food if they wanted to. Kenya can't. And New Zealand's sort of in between. 90% of the food we produce, we export. We have a surplus.
Great. Thank you. So coming to the room, can we come to this lady here? Oh, there's a.
My name's Gillian.
Could we just wait for the microphone, because then they'll be able to hear us in the branches. Sorry, Chris, we're stealing your microphone back off you. Yeah. We'll come to you next.
Hello. So what happens in Japan has very low food wastage. They're obsessed at minimum waste. So how does Japan feature in terms of food security?
Beautiful answer. And it depends where the food comes from. So Japan is a country that is particularly pernickety about the quality of the food it consumes. So no blemishes on apples or fruits, etc. So at consumption, Japan looks pretty good. But if you think of the full chain impact of what's going to Japan, it might tell you a different story.
Right. Thank you. Shall we go to Chris next?
Thank you very much. I'm struck with some parallels from last year. So last year we had Tim Spector, and he talked about the work that's gone on in nutrition with population data and the activities which he's undertaking as you take population and the mismatch of population data back to personal diet data, and how I didn't agree with everything he said. Some of it's really good and some of it's a very good business opportunity. But I'm struck here, we've got the same problem, which is we've got some very good global data. And how do we change that in a way which doesn't lead to the same problems we have with nutrition and the arguments and the confusion that goes on, as we translate that into actions for each individual, either business or person?
I think there's a big difference between last year and this year in that my research is monetized. I get money from the public purse, of course. That's how I monetize what I do to keep my employer happy. But with the Delta model, I think you have something that's very unique at the moment in that it's accessible. And that accessibility needs to be maintained in some form, because this has to be for everyone. It doesn't have to just be for the converted. And food science has to go into communities. Otherwise, it will not have the impact that we're expecting.
But to your point, we do need, and that's again our national modelling, which is a full capitals view of the system. So what are we doing today with as much data that we can get? And as I pointed out, it's not a national model, it's a multi-regional model, because actually in New Zealand, in Kenya, the regions are quite different, the soil types are different, the production's different, etc. It's a lot of work, but it's work we need to do. Otherwise, we're going to try and make changes in the absence of the scientific evidence that we need. The IOTA model will basically take the best information we can get on the thousands of SKUs that a consumer could buy in a particular location and try and track that back to the nutrient content of those foods and their environmental footprints, etc. But really, really important is this economic component. None of this is going to happen unless there's a viable economic system that can drive the changes. It is the food industry, after all.
Yeah, and I would just add, gamifying those options has opened my eyes as something that could be the glue that holds this all together, because you're looking to affect change without enforcement. Really good change is without enforcing that change, to do the right thing. And most people, so the gamification experts tell me, want to do good things. So that's the way to go.
Speaking of gamifying, that's one of the questions here. I think that's a new term for some people. Could you explain gamifying to us? And any examples to bring it crystal clear to life?
Well, I guess in real simple terms, and I am not the expert here, in my own terms, it's about giving context to the goal and getting to that goal interesting. So the person that's taking part in the game, I don't necessarily like language too much here, but someone that's taking part in the game actually understands the goals of where they're going. It's not just a number on a label or a traffic light on a label. You're actually taking part. I'm not a gamer. I've never really got it. But people tell me that we are wired to play games as a species. And I can see that there are elements in all of us, including myself, that like that element of competition, like that element that we're doing good and we're getting to something that's positive.
Let me give an example of what we do with our farmers. So we've had 400 farms that we've monitored for about 13 years now to develop their environmental footprints. And a few years ago, we took that out to roughly 10,000 farms in New Zealand, so that's all of our supply. And what the farmer gets is their greenhouse gas footprint. They get their water quality and a range of other things, but if I just focus on greenhouse gas, they get their greenhouse gas footprint, what makes up that footprint in terms of CO2, in terms of nitrous oxide, in terms of methane, and then the sources of those gases. Then what they get is how they sit against the average production for their type of farming system, because there's lots of different ways farmers farm across the 10,000 farms. So the numbers help here. It is a numbers game. They also get what their neighbours are doing. And this is so important. So you talk about gamifying, you talk about wanting to improve. That creates the incentive to change. So if my neighbour can do this, why can't I? But you've got to make the data visible at that local level.
Thank you. Coming back to questions in the room, shall we go to Helen?
Hello, Helen Munday, past president of IFST. To quote a song from Thomas Dolby, which you may remember, "You've blinded me with science." And do you remember who that was quote from? Magnus Pike, also a past president of IFST. Anyway, my point is that was all very, very scientific, very technical. A lot of big companies will have resources to be able to understand and implement this in due course. But 95% of food producers in the UK are small and medium-sized companies, and I suspect if you go to less developed parts of the world, that number increases even further. So how do you get that trickle down to be forced down as quickly as possible, so you're not just talking about the people who have lots of expertise and resources?
It's a really good question. I think Wayne's showing examples where you need to get the data, but the models that we're developing include SMEs and large enterprises as part of these national models. But But it's quite challenging. As I mentioned earlier, the New Zealand model is going to take us 5 years. We're pretty sure about that. We'll find there's quite a bit of data missing, particularly in that segment of the food industry that we're going to have to work with to develop primary data, to be able to include that data even in the models. That's one of the challenges we have with Kenya. When we look at where we are today with Kenya, we're missing so much of the data. We're going to have to spend a few years developing the data.
Yeah, I'm glad you answered that, Jeremy, because I'm still thinking about Magnus Pike. Anyone under 35 probably needs to Google now. Yeah. But the other thing, Helen, about Magnus Pike is, in the early 70s, he actually wrote a paper for the British Food Journal on carbon footprinting beef burgers. That's one of the first carbon footprinting papers. So quite an incredible guy with a lot of foresight, even though he had this on TV persona of the crazy scientist, enthusiastic scientist. And also anyone under 35 probably has to Google Thomas Dolby as well.
We're going to live forever. I suppose, at the ambitious 2040.
At least to 2045.
2045,
yeah.
we better get, I think that nutrition beyond 60 is a long way beyond 61.
Well, I'm going to be signed up to Zoe, the Delta model, with a lot.
A question from our Wales branch is there research taking place to develop manufacturing procedures which are more decarbonised? And if so, could these affect product quality?
Sorry, Tim, could you repeat that? I'm still thinking about
Magnus Pike, okay, come on, back in the room. Is the research into developing manufacturing processes that are more decarbonised? Part one.
Yeah.
Part two, can it affect product quality?
Yeah. Well, part one, yes, we're doing it. I'm an advocate of the project that I'm a principal investigator on, the Smart People, Smart Process, Smart Factory project. The main thing there is engagement with people, and we're showing decarbonisation in real time. The thing that really frustrates me, and one of the reasons why myself and Jeremy started working together, we realised that there's huge amounts of data, huge data sets around, but they're often latent and unused, and it takes people, innovative, creative people, to crunch them together and put them into packages like the Delta model so that they can be used. So that's part one, it's happening. And Jeremy's got examples, I've got examples. Yes, it's happening. And most companies want to decarbonise. It can be done at a national level, kilowatt hour, greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour has significantly gone down since the 1990s in this country. Yeah? In New Zealand, it's even net zero.
87% renewable. We're very lucky.
So it's a similar situation to Iceland. Yeah. The thing about decarbonisation, you're a prisoner of your lifestyle, but you're also a prisoner of your geography. Yeah. And you can't break the laws of physics here. You're always going to have an impact of some kind. Second part.
Can decarbonising affect quality? Those manufacturing processes that are focused on it.
Well, going about... Peter Hadjipiris is ringing in my ears here. Everything can affect quality. And quality is absolutely key. If you get quality right, sustainability will follow.
Yeah, so just to add to Wayne's answer, we're trying some pretty innovative things in New Zealand. 90% of our footprint occurs before the farm gate. It's in milk production. About 9% in manufacturing and about 1% in distribution, which is really efficient. But that 9% and collecting that milk, we're looking at some pretty innovative ways of doing that. We've got a thing called Milky, and Milky is a electric tanker. So we've got the biggest transport fleet in New Zealand. Now, to make that work, we have to have essentially batteries that can be interchanged into those tankers when they come in to the depots, because they've got to go out again. And just put that in context. At peak milk production, we have to process 80 billion litres of milk a day. Million, not billion. 80, that'd be a lot, wouldn't it? 80 million litres of milk a day, which is still a staggering number of Olympic swimming pools. So that's one thing we're looking at. The other is we're looking at installing one of the biggest heat pumps in the world. This is a 5-story, your heat pumps that you have, your Daikin heat pumps or whatever. This is a 5-story version of a heat pump to try and dry our milk powders and our protein products. And that one thing we will have to do is to make sure that the quality of that product is equivalent or better than what we had using our traditional processing methods. We're also using a lot of solid wood chip, those sort of fuels as well.
Thank you. Questions in the room? Stephen?
Sorry. You talked about the energy deficiency based on recommended dietary intakes. Do you take into account anywhere the actual consumption of dietary intakes?
So I think that gap's too big for Kenya. It can't be, they'd be dying in the streets. So what we think, and from some of the work we're doing with Gates, is there's a lot of homegrown. So this is nutrition in the back garden that's not accounted for in the full food system. That's good for subsistence, it's good for helping close the gap, but it's not going to provide that multi-capital approach to helping Kenya scale its agriculture given the size of the challenge. So it's too big. We don't actually know what that true gap is, but you've got quite prevalent stunting in Kenya, which is a consequence of protein and energy malnutrition.
Thank you. Come to Silverani in a moment. John, you put a question on here. Would you like to ask it out loud?
Thank you. It's a question about the difference between decarbonisation and carbon offsetting. So many small businesses think they're going to solve the world problem by carbon offsetting. How do you change? I mean, you talked before about the team needing not just the science but being good communicators. How do we communicate that changes nothing?
It's really important that science-based target initiatives lets you do insetting but not offsetting for those very reasons. If everybody was to try and do offsetting, how does that work, right? Where are the offsets coming from in such a scenario? It's kind of obvious, right? That won't work. So I think the key is to look at genuine reductions that you can make. And I think for really important sources of nutrition, you should look at the intensity as well as the absolutes. So if you're still producing higher emissions, but you're making significantly improved efficiencies, so units of nutrition per unit of greenhouse gas, given some of the gaps we've got in nutrition, I think that's also a legitimate thing and actually a necessary thing that we're going to have to do if we're going to close some of those nutrient gaps.
Building on that, you have a story, Jeremy, which you've already told Sterling and I once this evening, but could you tell us again now about a young lady sitting in an airport in New Zealand?
Yeah, so one of the things we try and do is provide context. We're really careful not to tell people what to do, right? As personal choice. So if you want to be a vegan, if you want to be a vegetarian, if you want to be a carnivore, my son's about as close as you can get to a lion. He literally turns green when he sees green. But none of which are necessarily, I wouldn't recommend a carnivorous diet, quite frankly, but you've got to be very careful. And within the context of personal choice, you've got to understand the context. And this is actually some work that we did in New Zealand using data to make a point. So you've got the young lady at Auckland Airport, and she's drinking an oat latte, thinking she's saving the planet by doing so. Now, she's entitled to drink that oat latte. I will be the last person to start choice editing for people, quite frankly. But if she thinks she's saving the planet, she should look at the data, right? Because she will be better actually having the nutrition from milk, because in New Zealand, the net effect of sourcing your nutrition from milk actually is quite a low carbon footprint. But the real important thing is actually the context. Milk consumption in New Zealand is about 1.1% of the 7,000 kilograms of carbon emissions that we have in New Zealand per capita, right? We're lower than the UK, but that is in part due to that 87% renewable electricity that I mentioned. But that flight, or that seat on that flight from Auckland to Wellington to go see her boyfriend is 1.5%, equivalent to 1.5% per capita emissions. Flying is very greedy. And again, I've flown from the other side of the world, so pretty big. We had a carless day the day I left for a long overseas trip, and I blew the entire budget of 400 people who decided to walk to work that day, travelling to the UK from New Zealand, so just to put it in context. But so it's about 3% for a return trip. If she was to drive from Auckland to Wellington, which is about 700 or 800 kilometres, that's about 1%. So it's about the same as a year's worth of milk consumption. So if she really is concerned about saving the planet, drink milk and get a local boyfriend.
One to remember. Silverani, I think, had a question. Do you want to wait for a microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like to go first, because you were holding the microphone?
Yes. So, great data set you shared there. And again, Wayne, you said that we can influence, but we can't really enforce. So my question is, do you think as scientists, we communicate, or really communicate findings, for instance? Because again, you're competing with people and professors on social media who have large followings, and scientists have always been accused of not really communicating well at a level that the common man understands. So what can we do to be better communicators?
I really don't like this idea that because we're scientists we can't communicate. Might be true for some, yeah. But this idea that people go into science because they can't communicate, I work against that at all points in my teaching, research. I think, I just think we need to communicate well, essentially. Yeah.
We put all of those young people I showed at one of those early slides through media training and communications training. And it's really about delivery. If they're not looking happy and relaxed and on point with what they're doing, it's not going to cut across. So there's an art to communicating any information, whether it's scientific or otherwise.
Sorry, Purity. I lost my thread a bit there because I'm probably Helen. I'm still probably thinking about Magnus Pike, but there was a real turning point for me because I was trained by journalists about 15 years ago how to communicate science stories, how to summarise quite complex information. I said earlier tonight one of the most valuable things that I learned during my PhD was how to draw a graph clearly. I mean, people present data terribly, generally speaking, even senior people, we all see it. But that clarity is really important. And a real turning point for me is I wrote an article about 10 years ago on reducing meat, a bit like the Auckland airport scenario. Might not be all it's cracked up to be. It might not be the golden bullet that we're looking for in decarbonisation. And that went round a few academic circles, but then it was syndicated by CNN Asia. 5 million readers, like that. Yeah. And that shows you the power. It's not just about communicating, it's traction within the community that you're working with. People who work for large organizations understand that traction, but leveraging that traction, and that's why, working with communities, SNI and so on is such a great thing for someone like myself to do. But you can get that level of impact from those communications as a scientist.
And be very clear, but be humble. If somebody can tell me they've got that diagram that Wayne had at the start of this presentation nailed, I need to speak to them for a long time.
Maybe we need to tell the consumer the inconveniences that they will face, because again, maybe that's where the impact would be. We need to become the Jordan Petersons of this world and not tone it down, maybe because we don't want to cause panic, as in become better marketers.
Final question from Selvarani, please.
Hello, yeah, thanks very much. It's a fascinating lecture. In your nutrient gap models, I noticed that you were tracking against the global average calorie consumption, which looks around 2,800 to me, kilocalories per person per day. So isn't part of the...
2.4.
2.4, okay.
The thing is, it's actually a bit less than that because it's demographically weighted, so it includes the... So one of the mistakes many models make is that everybody's a 70, 80 kilo man. Actually, yeah. Funnily enough, they're not. So every year that the model adjusts the population, it adjusts the projected demographics.
Okay.
Men, women, particularly certain age groups, have for such things as iron, micronutrients, folate, etc., a much higher demand in women of reproductive age, for example. So that's taken into account. It's very, very important, as is the bioavailability. If you miss the bioavailability of the nutrients, as I was saying, that's just wishful thinking.
I just wondered how the models compensated for the fact that some people are eating too many calories a day.
I think the US and the UK clearly showed that, right?
Yeah. But does the models predict what, if we're going to change obesity, what needs to happen in terms of policy?
So again, we're going to do health at a national level rather than globally. It's just too hard to come up with a global average for these sort of things. So what the model does really well is nutrient production on a global basis. What it won't do well is health impacts.
Yeah.
So you've got the likes of the global burden of disease studies, which are quite good at providing this sort of data.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you all to sit up straight, please, because we're going to move from model to models, because Jeremy and Wayne would love a photo with all of you in it. Robin, could you come and join us at the front? And if Wayne and Jeremy want to stand there, and we should be able to get a photo of you all in, is the intention. Do you want to stand on the stage?
So this is when it's not good to be on the front, right?
Yeah, indeed.
I think, are we better here so we're not blocking? Just like the Oscars. All right. Who's doing the bunny ears?
What about if we're up on the stage? Yeah.
Thank you.
The communications director of the S&I is a stickler. So if I go back without any collateral, I'll just get hammered.
Indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, may we please thank Wayne and Jeremy. So I'm very pleased just to round off the evening with a few short comments to say not only thank you to Wayne and Jeremy, but thank you to all of you. Thank you to our branches who have dialed in, been satellite events, and added their questions. And also thank you to the IFST team for all the effort that goes into this. So please, will you give them a round of applause? I should have said earlier, I am not Natasha Medhurst, as you probably recognise doing the questions. Unfortunately, Natasha was not feeling so well with suspected COVID. She's okay, but we decided probably best for her not to be here this evening. So I will share her best wishes with you, and I'm sure you will give them to her. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we've been up in space. We've been down on the ground, we've heard about local change. We've got one of our posts in Black History Month is about Sarah Thompson, who was responsible for the food safety on Apollo 11. So food science and food technology appears all over the space race, let alone the modelling that we're now hearing about this evening. Now, last year when I stood here, just one day into post, or it was the next morning, I said, what's your I in IFST? And I've got 3 I's for you this evening, and that is to innovate, to inspire, and to interact. So innovate is doing something new, and we've heard about the modelling this evening, we've heard about the experience, we've heard about the data that we can actually use to inform decision-making and indeed to look at what the trends might be. And thinking about those headlines in 2045, it's in our hands to be thinking which of those do we want to actually be working towards. To inspire, well, we've certainly had some inspirational stories, and I'm always going to remember about that young lady at the airport in Wellington and getting a local boyfriend. Instead of an OT latte, just a story brings it to life. So I hope that you will share your stories from this evening, particularly by interacting. We've got our reception here in London. There's also receptions happening at each of the satellite events. But please talk to each other. Please interact with each other. It's by making the connections that we can discover new opportunities. So speaking of new opportunities and looking forward, next year is our 60th Jubilee. We're calling it our Diamond Year, our Diamond Events. And we have 2 themes that we want to have running through the year. The first is, what has food science and food technology ever done for us? Do you remember the life of Brian? What have the Romans ever done for us? And that big long list that just started with the aqueduct. Well, the list of things that food science has done to impact our lives is something that we're going to be sharing next year, looking back on 60 years. Because our second theme is looking forward to the next 60 years and picking up what Sterling said. The biggest challenge that the big manufacturers in the food industry are facing is talent, to actually attracting talent. So one thing that we're working on at IFST is to think, encouraging our 13, 14, 15-year-olds to study science and work in food. Yes, love food, love science, but study science, work in food, and think of all the range of opportunities there are. So these are our 2 themes that we want to have as the legacy outcomes of next year. And to that end, we've got 3 events to share with you already. We're doing an event at IFE Manufacturing on the 25th of March next year, because we thought many of our members, and indeed many of our future members, will be at that conference. So please look out for that and details of it. Secondly, we're thinking of birthday events in each of our regions. We want to come out to each of our regions and actually combine it with a local event, but yes, drinks, yes, cake, and yes, celebrating 60 years and looking back on all that food science has achieved. And then we're going to have an autumn conference this time next year, and more details to follow on that. So one thing I'm very pleased to announce, which really plays to the education side of things, is in January, we're going to be launching an apprenticeships portal. This is our project Inspire, which has been a few years in the making. And what we wanted to do was plug that gap of the one-stop shop of how a young person can find an apprenticeship in food science or food technology. So please look out for details of this portal, because we're going to be asking companies to list their opportunities. And yes, it's the apprenticeships, but yes, it's also the student placements. So having this as a one-stop shop. What we've been inspired by is the RAF, and that is when a young person looks up for an RAF apprenticeship. Is that someone ringing for an apprenticeship, Sterling? Yeah, got one. Got one there? Very good, very good. Excellent, excellent. What we wanted to do was have a one-stop shop of where the opportunity is and how much they're going to earn, because those are the big 2 questions. So watch this space in January at the start of the year for our apprenticeships portal launching. And then we've heard it mentioned, not just the IJFST journal, but also our magazine. And our editor-in-chief, Charles Brennan, is here this evening. But please think of yourself as an author. MBNA Bank, I think it is now, Bank of America, have across their doors in their offices in Chester, think of yourself as a customer. Well, I'd like you to go one step further and think of yourself as an author. Be an author in our journal. They're really keen, aren't they, Sterling? They really are.
To sign up is Chu Yu,
Is it?
who's from China, actually, saying, can she sign up for an apprenticeship?
Fantastic. And she wants to be an author as well. Excellent. Well, being an author, everyone can be an author. Please get in touch with us. The details are on the different web pages for each of those. So my final thanks is to our sponsors this evening, to Leatherhead, and indeed to More People. Without our sponsors, we would not be able to put this event on, so please would you give them a round of applause. So the regional receptions are going to go and enjoy their time back where they are in the 5 locations around the country. And I'd like to say thank you to the committees that have made those possible. We want to be as inclusive as possible and reduce our carbon footprint by not having everybody travelling to London. And that's it. That's our lecture for this year. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if we could just finish once more, Jeremy and Wayne, would you mind standing up? I'd like to give them our thanks. Thank you very much. Please do come and join us for a glass of what you fancy downstairs. And if you're leaving swiftly, please have a safe journey home. And we hope to see you at our Diamond events next year. Thank you very much.